Look down at the back of your own hand for a second, right now, wherever you happen to be sitting. Not to judge it, just look. You can see things through it these days that you couldn't always see so plainly. A blue vein tracking toward your wrist, a tendon shifting when you flex your fingers, the faint shadow of the small bones underneath. Pinch a little fold of that skin between two fingers and let it go, and watch it take a second, sometimes two, before it settles back down flat again, the way it never quite used to. The world has exactly one word ready for what you're looking at: collagen. And exactly one thing to sell you the moment it says that word: a jar, a serum, a cream with a very confident label and a very small print of ingredients underneath it. I'm not here to sell you any of that tonight, and I'm not here to frighten you about your own hand either. I want to show you something happening down at a scale no mirror has ever shown you, and I think once you've seen it, your hand is going to look a good deal stranger and a good deal calmer than any advertisement has ever let it look. Here is the promise I'll make you for the next few minutes. Right now, when you look at the back of your hand or your forearm or the soft skin inside your elbow, you probably see one thing: a single surface, aging in some vague, general way you couldn't quite put into words if a grandchild asked you to. By the time we finish, you'll be seeing two separate layers instead, with a hidden seam running between them, and you'll know exactly what became of that seam, and why, and how much of what you're looking at was never really about age at all. Same hand. An entirely different thing to look at once you can picture what sits underneath it. Here's the first thing worth clearing up, because almost nobody ever explains it this plainly. Your skin was never one thing. It's two sheets, stacked one on top of the other, and they behave nothing alike. The top sheet is the one you actually touch, the one your fingertip meets first when you run a hand along your own arm. It's thin, remarkably thin, thinner than a sheet of paper in most places on your body, and it renews itself constantly, shedding and rebuilding from underneath every few weeks, whether you ever notice or not. Doctors call it the epidermis. It gives you your color, your texture, the surface you present to the world every morning, but on its own it carries very little of the skin's strength. Pinch just that top sheet by itself, and it would give way far more easily than the tough layer beneath it. Underneath it sits the sheet that does the heavy lifting, thicker by far, and this is where the real architecture of your skin lives. Picture the springy framework tucked inside an old, well-built mattress, a dense, interwoven tangle of long fibers running in every direction, some stiff and rope-like, giving the whole structure its strength, others more elastic, letting it stretch and spring back rather than crack under pressure. Those fibers have names you've probably heard tossed around in an advertisement without ever being told what they actually are. Collagen, the strong rope-like fiber. Elastin, the springier one. Together they form a scaffold, suspended in a thick, moisture-holding gel that keeps the whole structure plump and full rather than dry and compressed. This undersheet is called the dermis, and it's the thicker of your two layers by a wide margin, doing nearly all of the structural work while the thin sheet above it collects nearly all of the credit. So when someone tells you your skin is thinning, what they rarely explain is which sheet they actually mean. It's almost never the top one. The epidermis thins only modestly across most of your adult life, remarkably stubborn for something so delicate. It's the dermis that changes the most as the decades pass, its scaffold growing sparser, its fibers fewer and looser than they once were, the whole structure settling the way any framework settles once the material holding it up begins to thin out. That's most of what you're actually seeing when you look at older skin and sense, correctly, that something underneath has shifted, not the surface. The structure beneath it, quietly, out of sight. But two sheets stacked on top of each other still doesn't tell you the most interesting part of tonight's story. Because those two sheets were never simply resting against each other, flat, the way two pieces of paper might lie one on top of the other on a desk. Something is happening at the exact place where they meet, something built with an architecture I think you're going to find genuinely beautiful once you see it. And that's where I want to take you next. Look closely enough at the border where your epidermis meets your dermis, closely enough that only a microscope could ever manage it, and you don't find a flat line at all. You find a landscape, a rolling, undulating landscape of tiny ridges and valleys, peaks and folds, repeating itself across every square inch of you, invisible from the outside, but astonishingly busy just beneath the surface. Here's what's actually going on down there. The undersheet doesn't simply sit politely beneath the epidermis. It pushes upward into it, again and again, in thousands of tiny finger-like projections, and the epidermis folds itself back down around every one of them in turn, so the two sheets end up locked together the way two hands lace together, finger laid between finger, gripping in a way that flat palms pressed against each other never could manage. Doctors have a formal name for this interlocking border, and I'll give it to you once because it's worth knowing the real name of something this remarkable, the dermal-epidermal junction. I won't ask you to carry that mouthful around with you when you leave tonight. From here on, let me name it by what it does instead, the grip line. And what a grip line it is. Because of that lacing, your two layers don't just sit stacked on top of one another the way I described a moment ago. They're woven together at the seam, held against sliding, against shearing, against exactly the kind of sideways stress a body takes on constantly without ever thinking about it. A sleeve catching on a doorknob, a forearm braced against a countertop, a hand gripping the arm of a chair to stand up. A young grip line absorbs all of that without complaint, because the ridges run deep and the fingers lace tightly, and the two sheets simply cannot slip against each other no matter how you twist or press against them. So there it is. The part almost nobody selling you a cream ever shows you, because you genuinely cannot see it in a mirror, only under glass, magnified far beyond anything your own eye could ever manage on its own. Two sheets of you, laced together at a seam built from thousands of tiny interlocking ridges, gripping you tight, quietly, your entire life, without a single request for your attention. Now I want to tell you what happens to that seam, and to those ridges, somewhere around 60, because something does change there. Something real. And it isn't what the advertisements are telling you. Somewhere across the decades, quietly, without a single symptom announcing itself, that rolling landscape of ridges and valleys at the grip line begins to smooth out. The peaks that once rose sharply toward the surface flatten. The valleys that once dipped deep between them fill in and shallow. It happens the way any landscape wears down given enough time. Not a mountain collapsing in an afternoon, but a whole range slowly losing its edges across centuries, rounding, softening, drifting towards something closer to a plane. Researchers who study this under the microscope describe the grip line losing roughly a third of its depth by the time a person reaches their 60s and 70s. The ridges shrinking. The fingers of that old interlocking handshake between your two layers loosening on one another, year by quiet year. Once you're holding that image, so much else about older skin stops being a mystery and starts being simple physics. Flatten the ridges, loosen the laced fingers, and the grip weakens right along with them. This, I think, is the real answer to something you may have noticed already without an explanation for it. Why a bump against a table edge that would have meant nothing in your 30s now leaves a bruise that spreads and lingers for 2 weeks? Why a small tear along the forearm, from nothing more than brushing past a doorframe, opens a thin flap of skin in a way it simply never used to? You haven't become clumsier with age. The microscopic seam holding your two sheets together used to grip tight enough to absorb that exact motion without complaint. And now, with the ridges worn down toward flat, the layers shift against each other where they used to lock, and a shift like that is exactly what tears skin, and exactly what lets small blood vessels underneath rupture more easily than they once did, spreading that soft bruise you didn't even feel happen. There's something almost moving to me about this, honestly, once you sit with it a while. The very architecture that quietly fed your skin and held it together for 60, 70 years, without you ever once thanking it, simply wears the way anything wears that's been working that hard, that long, without a single day off. It isn't failing you. It carried you an extraordinary run at full strength, decade after decade, and only now, this late, does the landscape start settling toward something flatter. That isn't a story anyone selling a cream in 30 seconds between 2 commercials has time to tell you. But it's the true one. And I think it's a far kinder one than your skin is failing, ever was. Now, the flattening grip line is only half of what's changing down there. There's a second story unfolding at the same time. One level deeper, involving the cells that built that whole scaffold in the first place. And what some of them start doing once they retire is, I think, the strangest part of tonight. Down inside that undersheet, scattered all through the dermis among the collagen and elastin fibers, live the cells actually responsible for building and maintaining that whole springy scaffold in the first place. They're called fibroblasts, and across the whole of your life they have quietly done something genuinely remarkable without a shred of recognition for it, spinning new collagen, spinning new elastin, quietly repairing and replacing fibers as they wear, keeping that mattress-like framework underneath your skin full and springy, rather than thin and slack. As the years pass, a good number of these fibroblasts stop doing that work. Scientists have a word for the state they settle into, senescent, and it's a strange and specific kind of retirement, because a senescent cell doesn't die and clear away the way a worn-out cell often does elsewhere in the body. It stays right where it is, alive, still occupying its old spot in the tissue, simply no longer building. Except here's the genuinely strange part, and it's the part that surprised me most the first time I read about it. Some of these retired fibroblasts don't simply go quiet. They begin releasing small enzymes that snip apart the very collagen fibers they, or cells just like them, once spent decades building. At the same time, they release a steady trickle of chemical signals that stir up a low, simmering background inflammation in the tissue around them. Nothing you'd ever feel as pain or notice as swelling, just a quiet chemical smolder running underneath the surface year after year. Scientists have taken to calling this general pattern inflammaging, a low-grade, slow-burning inflammation that seems to accompany aging tissue almost everywhere it shows up in the body, skin included. So the scaffold underneath your skin doesn't only thin because production slows, the way you might picture a factory quietly reducing its output. It thins partly because some of its own former builders have started in a small and steady way, taking pieces of it back apart. That's such a strange thing for a body to do to itself that I had to read it twice the first time I came across the research. This idea that decline, at least in this one particular tissue, isn't only absence. It's occasionally activity, just pointed in a direction you'd never expect from cells that spent 60 years building. I don't tell you this to unsettle you because on its own it could sound like exactly the kind of thing worth lying awake over. I tell you it because there's something oddly comforting in simply understanding the actual mechanism, rather than living with a vague, formless sense that your body is somehow failing you for reasons nobody ever bothers to explain. A flattening seam. A number of quiet retirements, some of them turning gently destructive. That's the real machinery. Not a mystery. Not a moral failing. Just biology, doing what tissue does, on a timeline that was always going to arrive eventually for every one of us. Now for the part of tonight's story that will surprise you most of all, because it explains more of what you see in the mirror than the seam and the fibroblasts put together. Do something for me right now, if you're able. Roll up a sleeve and look at the skin on the inside of your upper arm, up near where it meets your armpit, the part that spent your whole life tucked against your body or hidden under a sleeve, the part sunlight has very rarely touched directly. Then look at the back of your hand again, the same hand we started with tonight. Same person, same age, down to the day. The same number of years lived by both patches of skin, exactly, with no difference between them at all except one thing. And yet they don't look anything alike, do they? The inner arm is smoother, softer somehow, closer in texture and color to skin you might remember from decades ago. The back of the hand looks like it belongs to someone considerably older than the arm sitting right next to it, on the very same body, having lived through the very same number of years. That difference isn't a trick of the light, and it isn't your imagination. It's one of the most well-documented findings in all of skin research, and it upends the whole story we usually tell ourselves about aging skin. Researchers call the two kinds of change by different names to keep them straight from one another. There's intrinsic aging, the changes we've spent this whole evening walking through together, the flattening seam, the retiring fibroblasts, the slow settling that comes simply from being a certain number of years old, working through all your skin in much the same way, wherever it sits. And then there's photoaging, the changes caused specifically by ultraviolet light-striking skin, direct sun exposure, decade after decade, hitting some patches of you constantly and other patches almost never at all. And here's the finding that deserves far more attention than it usually gets. When researchers compare sun-protected skin, skin like your inner upper arm, against sun-exposed skin like the back of your hand or your face or your neck, of the very same age, from the very same person, the great majority of what we casually call visible skin aging turns out to be photoaging. Not the calendar, not the years themselves, passing quietly on their own, the sun. Light striking the same patch of skin, again and again, for decades, doing far more visible damage than time alone was ever capable of doing by itself. I find that almost dizzying to sit with, honestly, once it settles in. So much of what we point to on our own hands and faces and call simply getting older was, this whole time, mostly a record of light. Every summer afternoon, every drive with an elbow resting in an open window, every walk without a hat or a sleeve, quietly writing itself into that particular patch of skin over 60 or 70 years, while the skin tucked under a sleeve aged far less by comparison. Your hands have lived a different life than your inner arm has, even though they've counted out exactly the same years. I'm not going to turn this into an instruction because that was never the promise I made you tonight. I only want you to notice it. The way I noticed it myself the first time someone showed me the comparison, and felt something shift in how I understood my own hands. Your inner arm and the back of your hand are quietly telling you two different stories about the very same lifetime, and most of the difference between them was never really about the years at all. If any of this has you looking at your own hand differently than you were a few minutes ago, a quick like helps this find someone else out there curious about the very same thing. wondering what's actually happening underneath a hand they've looked at every day of their life without ever really seeing it. Let me set the whole thing down in front of you at once now, all of it together before we close. Your skin was never one surface. It's two sheets, a thin outer one you touch and a thicker, springy undersheet doing the real structural work, built from a scaffold of collagen and elastin suspended in its own moisture-holding gel. Between those two sheets runs a hidden, undulating seam, thousands of tiny interlocking ridges lacing the layers together the way two hands lace finger between finger. With the years, that seam flattens, loses roughly a third of its depth, and the grip between your two layers loosens right along with it, which is a real part of why skin tears more easily and bruises more readily than it used to. Meanwhile, down in the undersheet, a portion of the cells that spent decades building that scaffold quietly retire, and some of them turn, strangely, toward gently dismantling the very structure they once built, adding a slow simmer of background inflammation nobody ever feels directly, and underneath all of it, mixed into every bit of it, sits a lifetime of sunlight, striking some patches of you relentlessly and other patches almost never, writing the greater share of what you actually see in the mirror, far more than the years on their own were ever capable of writing by themselves. Two sheets, a seam that flattens, builders who retire and sometimes turn against their own work, and light, more than time, doing most of the visible writing. That's the whole picture, sitting where a single word like collagen and a jar with a confident label on it never could quite reach. Here's what I actually want you to take from all of this, more than any single fact I've handed you tonight. Thin skin, loose skin, skin that bruises if you so much as bump a doorframe, isn't a mysterious failure happening inside you that you're somehow responsible for, something to panic fix with whatever the next advertisement in your feed happens to be selling this month. It's a change in a real physical structure, one you can now actually picture. A seam flattening, builders retiring. 60 summers worth of light settled quietly into the backs of two hands that have carried you your entire life. Understanding doesn't undo any of it, and I'm not in the business of promising you things I can't deliver. But it does something else, something that matters just as much. It takes the fear out of the chair it's been sitting in and lets something calmer sit down there instead. Not a cure, not a reversal. Just the plain, sturdy comfort of finally knowing what you're actually looking at when you look down at your own hand. Now, before I let you go tonight, let me say something plainly, the way I try to every time we sit together like this. I am not your doctor, and nothing you've heard from me tonight is meant to stand in for one. Ordinary thinning, the kind we've spent this whole evening walking through, translucent skin, a little extra bruising, a small tear now and then that heals in its own time, is one thing. And it's the thing this conversation was actually about. But skin that tears easily and won't heal properly. Wounds that linger far longer than they should. Changes that are spreading or genuinely worrying you. Deserve an actual doctor, one who can see you in the room, examine you directly, and know your particular history, not a stranger talking to you through a screen at whatever hour you happen to be watching this. What I've handed you tonight isn't a plan, and it was never going to be. It's only understanding. The plain and durable kind. The kind that doesn't come with a price tag on it and doesn't expire the way a jar on a shelf eventually does. So that's the whole of it, laid out the way I like to leave things before I go. Somewhere out there tonight, someone else is looking down at their own hands under a very different sky than yours. In a country you may never visit, noticing the very same veins, the very same faint tenting when they pinch a fold of skin and let it go, wondering the very same thing you were wondering a little while ago. Tell me down in the comments where in the world you're watching this from tonight, and whether any single piece of this surprised you the way it surprised me the first time I found the picture of that microscopic interlocking seam and couldn't quite stop thinking about it for days afterward. If sitting with me like this, looking a little closer at your own body and the quiet, patient architecture holding it together is something you'd like to keep doing, subscribe and stay close, and I'll be right here waiting the next time you've got a question about what's actually happening underneath your own skin. Go ahead and look down at the back of your hand one more time before you go. The veins are still there. So is the tenting if you pinch it. But underneath all of that, I hope you're seeing something different now than you were when we started tonight. Two sheets, a seam, a lifetime of light, and I hope your own hand looks a little less like a worry to you now, and a little more like the oldest, most faithful record you own of everywhere you've actually been.